Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Lana and today I'm taking you on a sewing journey to create an Edwardian outfit loosely inspired by this design from the Titanic Rose's Blue Flying Dress. The outfit will consist of 4 pieces that I will be making across the series of 3 videos. In every video I will be making a garment that will form the one element of the final ensemble. And every video will also have an informative little segment about Victorian fashion, namely the item that I'm making. So for example, in this video we are making the corset, so this video will have a corset crash course. Corsets are an old thing, centuries old. They have changed their shape over the course of those centuries, but the basic idea remains the same. Corsets served as a structural undergarment for a particular time period. Their aim was to help you achieve the fashionable silhouette of the era. Back in the late 16th century, we meet a predecessor of a corset called a pair of bodies. It was a structural undergarment and, as the name suggests, was a sort of bodice, stiffened with whalebone, not the actual bone of a whale, but the teeth. Basically what is in the whale's mouth, this little thing that's made of keratin, so it's both strong and still bendy and flexible. So it can hold a desired shape while still forming to the body and not rigidly, squishing you into that said shape. Bodies were most commonly laced in the back with spiral lacing, not cross lacing, that came into fashion a bit later in the 18th century. In the 17th century, the terminology shifts from bodies or a pair of bodies to stays, and it stays this way for quite a while. To simplify, stays in the 17th and 18th century helped you achieve a very typical conical or tubular shape. The shapes did vary a little through the course of basically 200 years, but because this is a crash course, I am simplifying it a little bit. Stays in the 18th century could be strapless or with straps that usually tied in the front here. They would be laced in the back, but could also be adjusted in the front. They could be worn with a stomacher, which was a V-shaped separate piece of fabric that was boned and could either be decorated or plain, depending on, your budget and your social rank. And stays could also be worn either under the garment with a dress over, or they could also be visible. Both was possible, especially working women. They would often wear just stays without some kind of an overdress because it was just more practical. Women of all social classes wore stays, but of course, if you were aristocratic or noble, you could afford more elaborate pieces, that goes without saying. Fashion changed quite a lot at the end of the 18th century, and stays too were evolving. After 1790, we basically enter a transition period into Regency, which kind of starts in the 1810s. Fashion was changing, the waistline was getting ever higher, the waist was not as defined as it used to be, skirts were narrower and simpler, you have the famous of the era empire style of dress, and the shape of stays was changing as well. There is no definitive point in history where stays became a corset, but generally speaking, in the Regency era, you have several styles of structural undergarments coexisting with one another. You have stays, you have something more like shorter stays, and you also have something that looks more like what we imagine a corset to look like. Regency corsets are quite simple looking. They are not heavily boned, they are usually reinforced with cording, they are elongating, and they follow the lines of the body rather than reshaping it drastically. Because in the Regency era the waist wasn't defined, or the waist was basically under the bust, you have either shorter stays or you have those natural looking corsets. That kind of makes sense because you don't have to have that cinched waist anymore. Those types of Regency corsets do have a busk in the front, which is either a piece of wood or something like whalebone, something sturdier that kind of keeps this shape very much straight. So those Regency style corsets are not conical like their predecessor stays, neither are they hourglass like the later Victorian corsets that are about to come next. So Regency corsets are very natural looking and they resemble Edwardian corsets quite a lot, I would say, and Edwardian era comes basically almost exactly 100 years from Regency. But first we enter the Victorian era, in the reign of Queen Victoria, so roughly from 1830s to 1900. Different styles of fashion come into fashion and exit, but the corset remains. Your typical Victorian corset is the hourglass corset, so cinched waist, emphasized bust and hips. This is probably what most people have in mind when we talk about corsets. So in the first half of the 19th century, that cinched waist, emphasized bust and hips was very easy to achieve because the fashion style of the era is very much in favor of that. You have large skirts, with wide crinolines, and you have big puffy sleeves that naturally emphasize the upper and the lower parts, so the waist very effortlessly looks narrower even if you don't cinch it very much. Now let's bust some myths about how women were fainting because their corsets were too tight. Tight lacing did exist. It became possible with the invention of metal eyelets in around 1830, but your average working woman is not interested in tight lacing because she has to work on a farm or do chores or whatever. She doesn't have time for fashionable trends that perhaps a small minority of young, fashionable, aristocratic women were interested in following. So tight lacing was a thing, it did exist, but it was far from common. Towards the latter half of the 19th century, corsets do become more shaping, very heavily boned, and the waist is typically emphasized even more because the dresses and skirts get narrower, not as puffy as, a couple of decades before. And with the onset of Industrial Revolution, they can also be machine and mass-produced. In the Edwardian era, so beginning of the 20th century, relevant for our Titanic and corset recreation, a new, healthier style of corset was introduced and gradually became all the rage. The S-shaped corset, or the straight front corset. As the name suggests, it was straight in the front and it had a curve in the back, which created the iconic Edwardian silhouette. And so in the 20th century, corsets gradually became less boned, they became elongating, so smoothing down the hips, and the bust line actually lowered, so they were more like mid-bust or almost under-bust. They would be reinforced with more cording instead, and this gradually necessitated the use of a brassiere. And well, the rest is history. The brassiere evolved and stayed, but the corsets kind of faded away. Well, at least as an everyday undergarment for most people today. So yes, it is the Edwardian shape of a corset that we are making today. I started off by making this small sketch. I made it according to this reference pattern of an Edwardian era corset. I scaled it up from the sketch and drafted it in proportion, though I had to adapt it quite a lot after this point for my particular measurements. I cut out the pieces for a mock-up out of this black fabric. Then I adapted the mock-up until I was happy with the fit. I filmed none of it, and then I moved on to the actual corset. It's made of just 2 layers, plain white cotton stiffened with iron-on interfacing. I attempted some cording at the top at the bust area, and I think it turned out quite interesting. I've never tried this before, so it was a fun little experiment. Then I pinned the pieces together. The bones, by the way, are just plastic zip ties that I use for all my corsets and stays that I make. I had to fix a few things, and I decided to shorten the corset here in the front a little bit, just to make it easier for me to move in. Then I inserted the busk like so. And I added a few finishing touches and trimmings, some lace that I had left over, so I only added it across 2 panels. I didn't have any more, so that's all I had to work with, but I think it still turned out pretty cool. These zip ties are a little bit thicker, a little bit wider as well. I think narrower, thinner ones would work better, but oh well. Now, I'm not 100% happy with the fit of this corset. It could definitely be better, but you know, I'll still give myself a little pat on the back because it is the first corset that I ever attempted making. It's very comfortable, though I'm not 100% sure if the placement of the bones is exactly right. I do still think it achieves a pretty cool silhouette, and I'm very much impressed with how much shape is achieved simply with cutting out the pieces in the specific way and, you know, with the interlining, interfacing. Even without the bones, the corset has a lot of shape. So here you can see me putting it on over my DIY petticoat, and the top is also a sort of Edwardian undergarment top. Technically I should be wearing combinations under this, but there was no time or energy or willpower to make them. Not yet, at least. So yeah, the undergarments aren't exactly correct here, so just ignore that, focus on the pretty corset. And yeah, I can't wait to wear this with the rest of my Edwardian inspired garments and to see the finished look of everything together. Please consider liking and subscribing if you want to see more similar content, and of course if you want to see the outfit come together. In the next video I'll show you how I made this lace shirt, as well as an Edwardian walking skirt basically, but a little bit modernized. And I'll see you soon.